If I am planning to centre my channel around chronic fatigue and philosophy, I guess explaining my own journey with chronic fatigue is a good starting point. I think I'm going to find this kind of awkward because I'm conscious of not turning this into some sob story where I tell you how hard my life has been, and in return you compliment me about how strong and brave I am. Don't get me wrong, a nice bit of sympathy would feel lovely. It would feed my ego nicely, but the question would have to be asked, why am I talking about my poor health on the internet? Is it because I want the sweet sympathy? In which case, I'm kind of pimping out my poor health as a vehicle of getting the dopamine rush you get when someone says something nice about you. However, if my objective is to create an educational YouTube channel about chronic fatigue and philosophy, telling people about my experience of chronic fatigue is a necessary part of that story. It's a nice introduction for the more important things that are to come later in the narrative. So my rule is, I'm allowed to describe being ill, but under no circumstances am I allowed to enjoy being pitied. And obviously all of that is completely dependent on someone actually watching this. So let's start with the basics. What do I think caused my chronic fatigue? So this starts with a caveat that I'm no doctor, and chronic fatigue is an illness that even doctors don't know that much about. So this is all speculation from the information I have about chronic fatigue. From what I've been told, and from what I've heard on the internet, some people are more likely to get chronic fatigue syndrome than others, so there might be some genetic component that meant I was predisposed to getting it. But there is usually some form of triggering. This triggering is usually a period of time or an event where your body is overwhelmed with some form of stress. This could be physical stress, psychological stress, or both. I've heard some people talk about how their symptoms started after they started a new job with longer hours and also started doing more sport where they were pushing their body physically more than they have before. But equally, I've also heard people say that they were living a completely normal life and they just suddenly got ill and essentially never got better. If you want to hear more about how chronic fatigue syndrome can occur from a doctor who's actually had it and knows what they're talking about, I recommend visiting the YouTube channel called CFS Unraveled, and I'll leave a link in the description. So I think I had a triggering event where I was both psychologically and physically under a lot of stress. For around 2 years leading up to this event, I had noticed I was taking longer to recover physically from things that my friends would recover from quite easily. For example, after going to a music festival where my friends and I would camp for the weekend, I would find it took me a lot longer to get back to like a baseline level of energy. But this was never too much of a problem. I also found myself getting a lot of flus and colds in those 2 years. Every other month it seemed like I was getting some form of illness. But it wasn't until around March 2019 that I think my chronic fatigue fully started. I was in my second year of university at the time, living in some grotty and dirty university house. At this point in my life, I was drinking a lot. I had gone through a period of drinking whiskey nearly every night before bed, and every weekend I was going out to some house party or dirty club. I was living the university lifestyle. But this just meant that I was constantly sleep deprived. I'd go out drinking Friday and Saturday, not get home till early hours of the morning, get a terrible night's sleep, and feel incredibly hungover, and then spend the rest of the week recovering and catching up on sleep, only to then do the whole process again when the weekend rolled around. It was only a matter of time before I burnt out. On top of that, I was living with 4 other people that I was close friends with. However, one of my housemates was having a rough time with his mental health and actually attempted to take his own life on a few occasions while we were living with him. Needless to say, this was a very stressful time for all who were involved, but fortunately he got the help that he needed and is doing a lot better now. So I was burnt out physically through my drinking habits, and I was burnt out psychologically through trying to help my friend. And then in March, I got a flu-type illness. I was used to this, so I expected it to last for around a week and then I'd be back to normal. And I did feel myself getting a little better after a week or so, so I went back to drinking and partying. But essentially from there I never got better. And nearly 2 years later, I still have the same symptoms from that very flu. And in fact I've gained a few new ones as well. So what are my symptoms? Luckily for me, compared to some people, I have quite a mild version of chronic fatigue. But no matter how mild the symptoms, it's very unpleasant having to deal with them every day, knowing they won't go away. The severity of my symptoms comes in waves. For example, recently I had a particularly bad phase where I was bedbound for 2 weeks and didn't even have the energy to walk into town and back. But then, over the summer, I was nearly back to full health. I was able to exercise and go out most of the day without noticing any of my symptoms. Symptoms have also come and gone. For example, during the first year, I would struggle to make it through a full day without having to nap. I think I was sleeping around 12 to 14 hours a day. I would obviously sleep at night, but then I would also need to sleep again at around 4 or 5 p.m. And it wasn't like I had a choice in this either. Sometimes I would be sitting at my desk doing university work, and next thing I know, I've opened my eyes and 2 hours have passed, and I've been asleep at my desk the whole time. This doesn't happen so much anymore. I think I've gotten better at managing my schedule so I'm less tired in the day. However, symptoms I didn't have before have popped up, like extreme muscle aches, heart palpitations, and even a weird pain in my kidneys. But throughout all of this, one symptom has remained near constant. I always feel like I have some level of brain fog and a headache. It's difficult to describe how this feels, but I think the best way to describe it is by comparing it to the first day of recovery after the flu. So you're not full on can't get out of bed ill, but it's the feeling you get when your symptoms have started to reside. Recovery is in sight, but your mental state still feels a bit laboured. You have glimpses of health, but you still have the fog from the illness sitting over you. It's like that, but you never actually get better. And sometimes this ends in sort of full on migraine headaches as well. It took me over a year to get a diagnosis. After a month of feeling like shit, I went to a doctor and they said it's probably just a particularly bad flu. Then after even more time, they suggested it might be something like glandular fever. And a few months later, I went back after still not getting any better, and they started taking blood tests for things like diabetes. While taking a blood test, they found that I had too much of one enzyme in my liver, so they thought it could be a liver problem. So I fannied around getting more blood tests for my liver, only for them to then say that actually it was nothing to do with my liver. Eventually, after being tested for everything else, they finally said it was probably chronic fatigue syndrome. So all that took a year. A year of having no idea what was wrong. Not having a diagnosis meant I kind of just second guessed myself. Maybe I wasn't actually ill. Maybe I was just a hypochondriac or depressed. But I didn't feel depressed, especially not at the start. If I was depressed, I knew it was because of the way I'd been feeling rather than the other way around. So finally, I got recommended to a chronic fatigue specialist. But then, COVID happened. Everything got pushed back. I moved back home from university and changed doctors. I never actually got that specialist. Like I said, the last summer passed, I was feeling a lot better, so I didn't feel the need to follow it up. I thought I was just going to get better. But unfortunately, I was very wrong. But yeah, that's the story of my chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah, and in case it's not obvious, the reason why my channel is called The Chronic Fatty is because I have chronic fatigue syndrome. One of my friends started calling me that after my diagnosis, and I think it's kind of funny, so why not keep it? But yeah, that's the introduction to the channel, telling you how I got here, and hopefully, if you liked what you heard, there'll be more stuff coming soon.